It's home to some of America's wildest spaces. More glaciers than any other state in the lower 48. High, icy reaches, attempted by only the hardiest souls. Pristine, high-altitude lakes and lush forests that march right down to the sea. Washington State is also home to one of the greatest cities in the West and the thriving cultures of some of America's oldest tribes. It was here where one man's passion for flight led to the largest aerospace company in the world, where the biggest name in software got its humble start, and where the remnant of a forced evacuation during World War II still stands. Ariel, Washington tells the story of the deadliest volcanic eruption in American history and journeys into the crater's still fiery core to discover why life is returning. From its earliest beginnings right up to today, even in the hardest of times, Washington rebounds. It's why this is the Evergreen State. The story of Washington State begins with a remarkable feature of our planet. Volcanologists call it the Ring of Fire, a highly active zone of volcanoes and earthquakes that stretches around the Pacific Ocean. In a deep ocean fault off the coast of Washington, two tectonic plates are in the midst of a slow-motion mashup. As these plates collide, they're uplifting mountains and volcanoes throughout the Pacific Northwest. Over millions of years, these primal forces have created a stunning range of peaks called the Cascades. They stretch from British Columbia in Canada in the north through Washington and Oregon, all the way to California. More than 20 of these peaks are volcanic, and 5 of those lie in Washington State alone. But the biggest and most hazardous of them all is Mount Rainier. Rising 14,410 feet above sea level, it's the tallest in the chain, the king of the Cascades. There's as much snow and ice on its surface as all the other Cascade Mountains combined. And that's why Rainier poses such a threat. Scientists believe it could be the most dangerous volcano in the U.S. today. If it erupts, a wall of volcanic mud could flow dozens of miles beyond Rainier, reaching Seattle's suburbs. For many thousands of years, the mountain has been stirring to life. Huge landslides have crashed down its flanks on average every 500 years. In one fog-shrouded valley below, archaeologists found buried intact trees submerged in 20 feet of mud. This valley was once the tribal territory of many Native American tribes, including the Nisqually. They called the peak looming above them Tacoma, meaning the big mountain where the waters begin. For centuries, the Nisqually have known about the power and danger of the volcano. For them, its summit, higher than the clouds, has been a place where powerful spirits dwell. In 1870, 2 white men asked a member of the tribe to guide them to the top, but he refused to go any higher than the tree line, convinced that the permanent ice, sudden storms, and belching fire of its highest reaches were no place for humans. But today, adventure seekers flock to Rainier. More than 9,000 climbers attempt the summit each year, taking their measure against the thin air, bitter cold, and treacherous gaps in the ice. Conditions are so challenging, the first Americans to summit Mount Everest practiced here on Rainier. At 2.7 miles above sea level, just breathing is painful. Climbers keep to a slow, steady pace, making the ascent in small groups, tied together by ropes. If any of these climbers falls into a crevasse, the rope line might be their only chance for survival. Shadowing them is a grim statistic. 2 to 3 climbers die each year on Rainier. In 1981, 11 climbers perished all at once in a single avalanche. In 1888, the naturalist John Muir scaled these slopes and discovered a sheltered area at 10,000 feet. It's now known as Camp Muir, the primary base camp today for those attempting the summit. From here, just climb another 4,330 feet and you've reached the top. That's less than 20 blocks in Manhattan, but this last leg typically takes climbers between 6 and 10 hours, depending on conditions. Despite all the difficulty Rainier presents, roughly half of those who try actually make it to the summit. And for those who do, it's an experience they'll never forget. When John Muir looked back upon the mountains he had climbed, he singled out Rainier as the grandest excursion of all for those seeking adventures and opportunities. That adventuresome spirit has been a key part of Washington State from its beginnings. At the start of the 1800s, when President Jefferson sent explorers to map the region, they weren't trying to climb its highest peaks. Their challenge was to reach the Pacific. In 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition finally reached Washington after a year of trekking across North America. They journeyed here, down the Columbia River, but their goal of reaching the coast was slowed by Washington's unending forests. Finally, on November 6, 1805, the horizon parted enough for them to realize the Pacific was just ahead. William Clark wrote in his diary, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." The Columbia River, Washington's southern border with Oregon, brought Lewis and Clark to their journey's end at the Pacific. Both men were born in Virginia. The eastern shore was the only one they had ever known. So arriving on this wild coast must have been beyond anything they'd imagined. As the author Annie Dillard has written, it was the rough edge of the world, where the trees came smack down to the stones, as if the corner of the continent had got torn off right here. And the dark trees kept on growing like nothing happened. A sense of what most of Western Washington looked like in the early 1800s can still be found in tracts of protected old-growth forests, like these along the Elwha River. Here, one can find Douglas fir and hemlock trees, hundreds of years old, rising 300 feet in the air. In the 1800s, as the era of exploration turned to settlement, Washington's breathtaking trees came to be seen as useful lumber. And soon, entire tracts of forest were cut. Still, more than 21 million acres, half the state's total land area, is covered in trees. But about half of that is open to logging. Timber harvesting remains an economic driver for Washington. It's the state's second largest manufacturing industry. But over the past 150 years, a lot has changed. This single piece of equipment, called a boom delimber, is cutting trees, stripping branches, and stacking logs, doing the work that an entire logging camp once did. A logging truck like this is typically carrying some 4,000 board feet of lumber. To imagine how much timber was harvested back in the late 1800s, with not much more than axes and saws and wagons to haul them, multiply this one truck by 40,000. In 1880, 160 million board feet of timber were cut, feeding the demands of West Coast boom towns like San Francisco. Today, when a load of logs arrives at a mill, they're meticulously sorted by species, size, and likely use. The lumber business is a highly mechanized trade, turning out a complicated array of wood products. Washington could not have become the sawdust empire without its great forest reserves, but the success of this industry owes a lot to just one man. He came to America as a penniless German immigrant, but Frederick Weyerhaeuser would build the largest timber operation in the state. More than 100 years later, logs are still piling up at Weyerhaeuser Mills. By the late 1920s, the world's largest sawmill was operating here, in Longview. Today, most of the lumber is bound for Japan. The trees are a select type of Douglas fir with fewer knots, tighter grain, and straighter lengths. They're prized in Japan for making furniture. Wood pulp and chips are important timber products, key ingredients for making paper and particle board. These chips will be processed into miles of newsprint for major U.S. newspapers, including USA Today and the Washington Post. In the 19th century, most of the state's wood products headed north to this port and helped fuel the fortunes that built Washington's signature city, Seattle. By the 1870s, Seattle, Washington was a bustling mill town. Its deepwater port on Puget Sound made it ideal for shipping lumber south to San Francisco. But a port wasn't Seattle's only advantage. Since the city was built on hills, mill owners could skid their logs right down to the waterfront. That's how the term Skid Row was born. In the 1890s, there wasn't a single building taller than 6 floors. Today, its downtown skyline competes with any on the West Coast. More than 10 rise above 500 feet. At 937 feet, the Columbia Center is the tallest building in the state and has helped identify Seattle as one of America's most modern cities. Over the past decade, Washington's overall growth has been steady. Seattle is now home to more than 600,000 people. But not all of them live on land. The shores of Lake Union are home to 500 houseboats. Some of them are so chic, they were featured in the film Sleepless in Seattle. The history of these houseboats goes back to the 1880s, when they weren't much more than floating shacks built to house timber workers. With its stunning waterfront, hills, and inland waterways, Seattle has evolved into an uncommonly beautiful city. But its latest prosperity resides less with lumber than with the success that arrived with the computer revolution. That economic miracle built a company called Microsoft and a personal fortune that was used to build this $53 million mansion for one of the world's richest men. Ironically, when Bill Gates built his dream house on the banks of Lake Washington, the exterior design was not overtly high-tech or modern. He chose the most traditional of Washington's resources, wood. More than 500,000 board feet. Support beams were salvaged from an old lumber mill. But inside, the 7-bedroom, 10-bath, 6-kitchen mansion does have some electronic toys. Miles of fiber optic cable, a reception room with a 22-foot wide video display, and a computer control system that can keep tabs on visitors wherever they are on the 5-acre estate. But the road to Washington's success has never been straight or easy. Behind its sophisticated veneer, there's a history of hard work and struggle, cycles of success and collapse, and through it all, a persistent spirit of innovation. One of the city's earliest challenges was to devise ways to move heavy freight from inland Lake Washington to the ports on Puget Sound. The solution was the Chittenden Locks, part of an 8-mile-long ship canal that helped speed the movement of logs and milled lumber through the city and carried salmon fishing boats to canneries. The locks are a critical link in the canal. One of their tasks is keeping the salt water of the Sound from reaching the freshwater lake. Washington's ports were strengthened in January 1893 with the arrival of the Great Northern Railway and the Transcontinental Line. Roughly 45 years after tribal leader Chief Seattle had relinquished the region to just a few hundred American settlers, the city of Seattle was now the economic hub of the Pacific Northwest, with a population of more than 80,000. Flying over the heart of downtown Seattle, there are few reminders of the 1800s when it first came to economic prominence, but one remains on the campus of the University of Washington. Today, 41,000 students attend classes here, and Go Huskies is the cheer. Among its graduates are martial artist and actor Bruce Lee and world-renowned glass artist Dale Chihuly. The university is also the #1 supplier of graduates headed to high-tech companies in the Northwest. And in the center of campus, a keepsake of Seattle's economic past, the Drumheller Fountain. It's all that's left of the 1909 Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, a World's Fair to celebrate Seattle's role as the gateway to the Alaska Gold Rush. Back in 1897, a strange fever was blowing from Alaska, inflaming the dreams of men with visions of gold. Seattle's docks were the embarkation point for nearly 2/3 of the more than 100,000 prospectors headed to the Klondike gold fields in Alaska and the Yukon. Where cruise ships dock in Elliott Bay today, steamships and schooners departed for Alaska more than 100 years ago. When these vessels and their men returned, they brought with them Klondike gold, worth millions of dollars, that passed through banks in Seattle. Klondike miners spent vast sums at Seattle businesses for supplies. The result was a huge expansion of the city, doubling its population again. Seattle may be Washington's largest city and its economic driver, but the state's political center actually resides 45 miles south. In 1889, when Washington became the 42nd state, the city of Olympia was made the official capital city. Given Washington's frontier sensibility, the extravagant design of its state house has been controversial. A 278-foot-high dome towers above a neoclassical facade. At its completion in 1924, it was the 4th largest dome in the world. A 5-ton Tiffany chandelier sparkles inside. By the early 20th century, Washington had arrived, a regional powerhouse built upon the pillars of logging and gold. But by the early 1900s, that foundation began to splinter, made worse through decades of labor strikes, World War I, and the Depression. Little noticed within all the gloom, Washington had a savior, literally emerging from the clouds. He took his first flight in 1915, sitting out on the wing of a small seaplane as it took off into the sky over Puget Sound. William Boeing had been running a successful timber company, but within a year of that first flight, he had launched an airplane building business. Soon, the Boeing Airplane Company was on a glide path to greatness. It expanded with the growing Federal Airmail business and retooled again to build the heavy bombers that helped win World War II. It made rockets for NASA and more passenger aircraft than any other firm. 25 miles north of Seattle, near Everett, is Boeing's mammoth 747 Division plant, the largest building in the world when measured by volume. 472 million cubic feet, the equivalent of 75 football fields. It's also where the company's latest model, the 787, or Dreamliner, is built. It's the most fuel-efficient plane the company has ever made, though its production has been plagued with years of delays. A 787's wingspan, more than 160 feet, is longer than the entire distance the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. Everything at the Boeing plant is big. The 6 bay doors on the south side of the plant are decorated with the largest single digital image ever created, as recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records. During assembly, some of the unfinished planes remain covered in a green mylar coating that protects the skin of the aircraft from damage or corrosion. Building the planes is only part of the job. Every new aircraft model that Boeing produces is tested hundreds of times, on the ground and in the air. What William Boeing began in the 1910s had, by the 1960s, transported the state into the jet age. And nothing says it better than the Space Needle. This was the tallest building west of the Mississippi when it was completed for the 1962 World's Fair. For an America caught up in a space race with the Soviets, the Needle seemed to symbolize the spirit of the future. Even the elevators were a marvel, traveling at 14 feet per second, as fast as raindrops falling to Earth. From its observation deck, visitors get a stunning 360-degree view across Seattle, the Puget Sound, and on clear days, the snow-capped peaks of the Cascades. But what they can't see from here is the hidden side of Washington, where lush forests give way to a surprising landscape that was once home to one of the largest and most secretive military sites in America. In so many ways, Eastern Washington is the mirror opposite of its western half. Unlike the very wet, mountainous, tree-covered west, this is dry, flat, open country, robbed of rain by the high Cascades. Washington's other half is so naturally parched. In 1906, the federal government embarked on a massive irrigation effort along the Yakima River. It was known as the Yakima Project. Over the succeeding decades, dams and irrigation canals were built to harness the power of the river. Soon, more than 500,000 acres of sagebrush were transformed into an agricultural Eden. Welcome to Washington's breadbasket, one of America's most productive agricultural regions. Today, the state ranks first in the production of a whole host of crops: red raspberries, peas, hops, sweet cherries, pears, and Concord grapes. But no other state comes close to Washington's output of one signature American fruit: apples. Washington has been America's apple king since the early 1900s. And when you think apple, think Yakima Valley. Most of the state's apples come from orchards like this one. A single tree might yield nearly 2,500 apples in a season. That's 300 apple pies. Add up all the apples harvested from all the trees in Washington in a year, and you've got a big number. Nearly 5 billion was the estimate for a recent year. That's 60% of the nation's total apple crop. Besides irrigation, there is another critical component to Yakima's success. Where there are farms, there are farm workers. And for the past half-century, migrant labor has been key to the Yakima story. Nearly half of the region's population is Hispanic, a legacy of the U.S. government's Bracero program, which brought Mexican workers here during World War II when farm labor was scarce. Yet overall, population in this half of the state continues to be sparse. It's home to just 1/4 of Washington's entire population. During World War II, the region's low population density caught the attention of the Pentagon. This vast stretch of land used to be the small farming town of Hanford. The main classroom of Hanford High School is all that remains. It's the remnant of a sudden, forced evacuation. In 1943, the sounds of students playing in the halls of this high school disappeared. So too did almost all traces of the town itself. That's because the U.S. government hastily relocated the area's 1,500 residents and assumed control of 500 acres of land along the Columbia River. For the next 40 years, this was a secret facility that produced enough plutonium to build 60,000 atomic weapons for the U.S. nuclear arsenal. The Hanford site required an enormous supply of power. Until the reactors started generating their own electricity, hydroelectric power from the river was crucial. So was its water, which was used to cool the reactor's fuel rods. But yesterday's war effort has left deep and dangerous scars on this landscape. Hanford is the most contaminated nuclear site in the United States today. Now, the work here is largely confined to cleaning up some 50 million gallons of underground radioactive waste left behind. Irrigation and the arms race may have transformed Washington's eastern desert, but much of the state still remains out of time, wild and untamed. From miles of dry land that line the banks of the Columbia River in the east to the stunning high-altitude ponds and craggy peaks of the Alpine Lakes wilderness area in the center of the state. Here, more wildlife than people run the trails. It's estimated that more than 25,000 black bears still reside in Washington. They are busy in the fall, foraging up to 20 hours each day, increasing their body weight for the long winter ahead. Today, nearly 40% of the state remains undeveloped. But the wildest and most remote place in all of Washington lies in the northwest corner of the state. This is the Olympic Peninsula. Its string of peaks and forests covers more than 3,000 square miles. It's so remote, it was one of the last places in the continental U.S. to be explored by white pioneers. In 1788, a British mariner passed by these jagged, snow-covered mountains. They seemed a perfect dwelling place for Greek gods, so he named them the Olympic Mountains. Mount Olympus, the highest peak in the range, is covered with glaciers. The most spectacular is the Blue Glacier. Starting at nearly 8,000 feet, this river of ice twists and turns down to an elevation of just over 4,000 feet, making it the lowest altitude glacier in the U.S. With terrain like this, explorers didn't penetrate this rugged land until as late as 1885. It took them 6 months to cross the peninsula and survey and map the area. Their leader, Lieutenant Joseph O'Neill, later called it useless for all practicable purposes. But in 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt recognized the value of this territory and designated it the Mount Olympus National Monument. 30 years later, FDR created the Olympic National Park. Now, more than 1.5 million acres of land here are protected. 95% of it remains wild. It's home to the last of the giants. These are some of the tallest coniferous trees in the world: Douglas fir, spruce, cedar, and hemlock. Enormous evergreen trees over 30 stories high. Their downward drooping limbs are well adapted for living in a temperate rainforest, perfectly designed for shedding water and snow. Scientists believe that this environment may hold as much biomass per unit area as any tropical forest. There's something about this part of Washington that conjures up a sense of mystery. Perhaps That accounts for the dozens of supposed sightings of the strange and unexplained Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, stalking these damp and dusky forests. The term Sasquatch may derive from a Pacific Northwest Indian word, Sesquak, meaning wild man. But despite miles of dark and seemingly endless forests, a Native American tribe called the Quileute has lived here for millennia, fishing along the coast and hunting in the river valleys that rise up to the Olympic Mountains. The Quileute believe their ancestors were wolves, an animal that once roamed freely in these forests. This region's isolation has helped its Native American tribes preserve their traditions and beliefs. The peninsula is also home to the Makah, a Native American tribe renowned for their canoe making and for their skill in hunting whales. An intrepid crew of 6 paddlers and 1 harpooner armed with wooden, iron-tipped spears could wound and eventually exhaust a whale. At the 87th Makah Day celebration, the annual canoe competition is underway. Teams of men and women must cover grueling ocean courses ranging from 3 to 7 miles. It's easy to see why the Makah call themselves the people who live near the rocks and the seabirds. For these ancient mariners, the Pacific was their prime hunting ground, and fishing continues to figure prominently for the tribe. In addition to pursuing whales, Makah hunted seals for food, oil, and skins. The Makah and American flags fly alongside one another. This nation within a nation has sent soldiers to every major conflict America has fought since World War I, and every single one came home alive. With their young people now serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Makah hope this unbroken streak will hold true. The Makah Reservation covers the northwestern tip of the continental United States. It's also the head of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This waterway is the only route for giant freighters heading to Seattle. At the center of the strait lies America's international border with Canada. Follow this border east, and then, as it heads north, hugging Vancouver Island, you arrive at a small archipelago, still in U.S. territory. It's as if a tiny part of the continental U.S. had tried to escape to Alaska. These islands are known as the San Juans. 20,000 years ago, this entire area was covered a mile deep in glacial ice. In some places, the ice sheet is estimated to have been more than 3,400 feet high. As the glaciers advanced and retreated over many ice ages, they carved out this entire archipelago. How many islands are there in the San Juans? No one seems to agree. At least 200, but the number can reach as high as 800 if one includes every rock and reef poking above the waterline. Getting from here to Seattle would be difficult if not for the Washington State Ferries. These distinctive green and white boats make up the largest fleet of auto passenger ferries in the U.S. The inland waterway between British Columbia and the Port of Seattle covers nearly 2,500 square miles of land and water. So it takes a fleet of 23 ferries, and in the course of a year, they carry over 23 million passengers to 20 different ports of call. For anyone arriving in the city at nightfall, Seattle's skyline is a jewel box of lights. Its greatest icon, the Space Needle, was once a symbol of the city's prosperity. But within just a few years of its completion, Seattle's prospects were looking dim. It was the 1970s. The aerospace industry began to shed jobs. The city's population plummeted, and Seattle's economy started to crash. And then came another extraordinary blow. Mother Nature delivered a punch that riveted the entire world. Throughout its history as a state, Washington has persevered, remaining evergreen despite periods of hard times. But on the morning of May 18, 1980, the challenge that nature delivered was a singular shock: the eruption of Mount St. Helens. This is all that's left of what once was a majestic mountaintop. The decapitated summit still smolders, an active reminder of one of the greatest natural disasters in American history. Below, thousands of uprooted trees still float on nearby Spirit Lake, stunning evidence of how powerful these kinds of geological events can be. On the morning of the eruption, a young volcanologist named David Johnston was monitoring the volcano for the U.S. Geological Survey. Johnston was on a ridge 6 miles away, a perfect vantage point. He understood the risks, but it was his chance to study a volcano that hadn't been active for 123 years. At 8:32 a.m., as Johnston looked on, the volcano was suddenly jolted by a 5.1 magnitude earthquake. The initial eruption caused a massive collapse of the mountain's northern slope. Johnston was the first to report the eruption, sending USGS headquarters in Vancouver the message, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Within minutes, a superheated cloud of gas and debris blasted down the mountain at supersonic speed, devastating nearly 250 square miles of forest. Johnston's remains have never been found. Today, this observatory, named for Johnston, sits on the very ridge where he last stood before being hit by a lateral blast from the volcano. Mount St. Helens delivered the deadliest and most economically destructive volcanic event in U.S. history. 250 homes, 47 bridges, 185 miles of highway, 57 lives, all destroyed in just hours. Today, the volcano is relatively quiet. Hikers can even peek right into the crater. The surrounding slopes provide an unusual natural laboratory to assess if and when the landscape might recover. Some places have yet to heal. The superheated blast of gases, mud, and debris that came off the volcano scorched the ground to such a degree it created a sterile moonscape, allowing little to grow. Yet in other ways, the rebirth has been remarkable. Wild mountain goats have returned and are picking their way across St. Helens' blackened slopes. Herds of elk are flourishing again too, as nutritious plants are surprisingly plentiful. In areas that were once barren, trees have returned in great abundance. The ash that spread across the region has worked well as mulch for regrowing forests. After the eruption, the Weyerhaeuser Company salvaged miles of flattened forest, enough wood to build 85,000 homes. But they immediately began replanting. 18 million trees, all started in the ground by hand. It's hard to find a bigger example than Mount St. Helens to express the evergreen capacity of Washington State, its ability to recover from natural and economic disasters alike, enduring the booms and the busts to rise again. But in the history of Washington, nothing has ever risen as high and as fast as the once tiny software company, Microsoft. Just 2 months after Mount St. Helens erupted, Seattle-born Bill Gates and his partner Paul Allen received a surprise phone call from the biggest computer maker at the time, IBM. Soon, Microsoft's operating system was running most of the world's personal computers. 6 years later, the company moved to this campus in Redmond, along with 10,000 employee millionaires and 4 billionaires. Today, it's one of the largest corporate headquarters in the world, and it's built to keep their programmers happy. A soccer field, a baseball diamond, 28,000 works of art, and 25 high-end cafeterias. And Microsoft isn't the only company in Washington's digital neighborhood. Nintendo of America is also based in Redmond. In North Bend, They use this massive distribution center, larger than 8 football fields, to process some 20,000 orders a day. It's hard to calculate the ripple effects of the computer gold rush on Washington State, but one statistic is telling. Microsoft started its high-tech business with 30 employees. Today, the company employs 40,000 people, more than the number of workers in the state's signature businesses, forestry and lumber. Given the success of so many of Washington's upstarts and visionaries, one might be tempted to think of the state as all business. Not so. The Pacific Northwest is a haven for fun. With rivers and lakes and the ocean so close, water sports are everywhere, and in some cases, extreme. On windy Lake Washington, the high-flying and sometimes dangerous sport of kite surfing took off in the late 90s. Outdoor recreation has a devoted following in the state, a pursuit whose roots go back to the early 1900s. Haystack Rock at the summit of Mount Si is one of Washington's most popular climbs. In the 1930s, mountaineer Lloyd Anderson had trouble finding a local vendor for a reliable ice axe, so he imported one from Switzerland, which led him and his friends to start the famous outfitting co-op REI. Another outdoor enthusiast, Washington-born Eddie Bauer, made a goose-down jacket for his winter hunting trips. He patented the design in 1940. From Bauer's small sporting goods company in Seattle, revenues have grown to nearly $2 billion, with over 500 stores across the country. A passion for the outdoors and a belief in caring for the planet are two sentiments that are very much in evidence in this state. An entirely different form of fun, also quintessentially Washington, can be found in the region's famous cafe culture, popularized by the coffeehouse colossus, Starbucks. In 1997, the company took over a Sears distribution center, which was once Seattle's largest building. Gazing out from atop its tower is the company's trademark mermaid. Inside, they have an atrium where they grow coffee trees. As legend has it, Starbucks was named for a character in Moby Dick. And like the great white whale itself, no other coffee business compares. Over 15,000 stores in 50 countries. And to think it all took off from a single shop in Seattle, selling coffee beans. It's just that fascinating combination of free thinking and thinking big that has come to define Washington State. One of its latest incarnations is the Experience Music Project. Just steps from the foot of that older icon, the Space Needle, the EMP as it's known, is first and foremost a museum honoring rock and roll. 21,000 aluminum shingles cover the exterior, painted to reflect the finish on electric guitars. From above, the Frank Gehry design seems more like a burst of abstract rock and roll energy than a building. And that's in keeping with the aim of one of its founders, Microsoft's Paul Allen. Rather than simply house rock memorabilia, the EMP is about appreciating music and inspiring musicians of the future. There's also a focus on local music that includes artifacts from the lives of Washington natives like Jimi Hendrix and grunge icon Kurt Cobain and his band Nirvana. It somehow seems fitting that a museum here puts its most artistic face on the outside. The idea reaches its most amazing expression in an unusual environmental project in downtown Seattle. Just a year after it was opened, the Olympic Sculpture Park was awarded the 2008 World Architecture Award. It was honored for transforming a drab highway interchange along the waterfront. Today, it's a Z-shaped park that leads visitors on a 2,200-foot path through the 4 main ecosystems of the Pacific Northwest. An evergreen forest, a meadow filled with grasses, an aspen grove, and a saltwater shore. All in one 9-acre site, visitors can explore a sampling of the microclimates that give Washington its extraordinary diversity. A case of inspired urban renewal for a state that's continually being reborn. Top it all off with Alexander Calder's 39-foot sculpture, The Eagle. And you have something to symbolize that spark of innovation that's always been such a part of the Washington story.